If you ask the right questions, the answers will take care of themselves. This is the Extreme Stewardship Podcast, where we explore anything and everything that gets us better at making things good and good at making things better. Right now, I'm interested in getting better at one specific thing, and that is knowing and understanding my commander's intent. Meaning, God has put us on a specific mission, and we need to know what that mission is, why we're doing it, and what the basic parameters are for how we're going to get it done. And that means we need to get better at listening to His explanation of the mission and making sure we understand it. And that means, among other things, growing in our ability to read the Bible. I want this approach to studying your Bible and finding your commander's intent to be usable, to be repeatable. And that means you can't need hours at a time to follow the procedure. For most of us, studying the Bible is not our primary work, which means something else is our primary work, which means that other thing has to occupy most of our time. That's not a bad thing. If building houses is the good work that God has for you, you shouldn't feel guilty about spending more time this week building houses than reading your Bible. Now, that being said, because we don't want to just do our work, we want to do it well, and we want to keep doing it better and better, and part of getting better at our work is to get more and more clarity on what the boss wants us to accomplish in that work. That's why studying our Bibles is a critical part of getting better at making things good and good at making things better. But again, just like you can't spend all day studying marketing but not do any marketing, you can't spend all day sharpening your knife but never actually use it to cut anything, you can't spend all day hearing from your commander what he expects out of your work but never go do the work. So we need a way to read the Bible and understand our commander's intent in the time that we have. And there are a couple of things I want to say as we get into this. The first is that the process of studying the Bible is more like deepening a mystery than solving a problem. That means every time I read my Bible, there's more. At first, that's meant to humble us, to make sure we never think we have the whole thing figured out. But as we go on, that's meant to encourage us, because we should never be discouraged by the feeling that we haven't got the whole thing figured out. However much time I spend reading any given part of my Bible, however deeply I study it, however much thought I put into it, I'm never done. If I have 5 minutes, that's fine. I'm not done. If I have 5 years, that's fine too. I'm not done. Either way, the pressure is off to figure everything out. Quick story about this. I did a PhD in New Testament, and the grand finale of that journey is a dissertation, which means I went absolutely as deep as I possibly could over a 4-year period into one issue in one text in the book of Hebrews. Now, there are only a couple of books on the planet that are 300 pages of every conceivable angle on Hebrews 12:18-29, and I wrote one of them. If Malcolm Gladwell is right that 10,000 hours makes you an expert, I am definitely an expert on those 12 verses. But here's the crazy thing. When I teach on those verses in one of my classes, more often than not, a student notices something I hadn't, or asks a question I can't answer. In 90 minutes, I learned something new from a bunch of freshmen. And that's just one text in one book, maybe half a page in my Bible. We are never done growing in our understanding of the commander's intent. In fact, if I'm reading my Bible and I walk away with unanswered questions, that means I'm doing something right. This is why my whole approach that you're going to get on this podcast is built around learning to ask the right questions. So far, we've got 5 big buckets, 5 different kinds of questions to ask: literary questions, historical questions, canonical questions, theological questions, and practical questions. Asking these kinds of questions means I keep moving in a certain direction because that's more important than trying to arrive at a specific destination. The point is to do, not to be done. Now, here's another thing to have in mind. When you think about the 5 kinds of questions, you might wonder how you're going to have time to hit all 5 every time you open your Bibles. Well, you're not. I mean, I really want the last kind, the practical questions, because that's where the commander's intent becomes clear. If I never get to those questions, that's not good. But prior to that, how much energy I spend on each of the other 4 kinds of questions really depends on the text itself, because each text is different. So I have to come to each text wondering which kinds of questions are really going to matter in this text. Here are a couple of quick examples. I'll probably do a whole episode on each of these later, but this will be a good warm-up. My favorite story in the Bible, the transfiguration of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 17. Jesus has this weird moment where he goes hiking with 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John. And while they're on top of a mountain, Jesus starts glowing like a light bulb. Moses and Elijah show up. A cloud talks to the 3 disciples, and the disciples start talking about what their junior high Sunday school teachers told them about the book of Malachi. A very interesting, very bizarre story. So I do a quick read through the story, 13 verses in all, wondering which of the first 4 kinds of questions ought to occupy my attention. And what sticks out right away is that I see Moses and Elijah on a mountain, which reminds me of Exodus 19 and 20 and 1 Kings 19. I see Jesus called a beloved son, which reminds me of Isaac in Genesis 22. I see someone's face getting real shiny, which reminds me of Moses in Exodus 34. I see talking clouds, which reminds me again of Exodus 19 to 40. And then there's the reference to Malachi 4 by the disciples when they mention Elijah coming before the day of the Lord. Now, if I've got limited time to work with, I'm going to devote that time to the canonical questions, because this story is so full of connections between Jesus and all sorts of Old Testament things. And maybe I get to the other kinds of questions, maybe I don't. But if I walk away from this story with a deeper sense of how Jesus shining on the mountain connects to the overwhelming presence of God on Mount Sinai, there's a decent chance I'll also walk away with something useful, even if I haven't done a deep dive into the literary and historical and theological issues. And maybe I noticed that Peter and Elijah both met God on the mountain, and both Peter and Elijah tried to stay there and avoid dealing with the complications of real life with real people in the real world. And I ask myself whether my mission at the moment includes some hard conversations, some stepping into someone else's mess, maybe some necessary conflict. Now, if I stop there, I certainly have not uncovered everything there is in that story. But I've listened enough that I can walk away asking a practical question that is prompted by that story and is challenging for me as I try to act on my commander's intent. Here's another example. Psalm 22. Now, literary issues are pretty much always going to be top priority when I read a psalm, so I'm starting there. And the first thing I notice is that this psalm goes from really bad in the first half, we call that a lament psalm, to really good in the second half, we call that a praise psalm, and it's not really obvious how we got from one to the other. I notice a lot of animal imagery, like David's enemies being bulls and lions and dogs and that sort of thing. I notice a couple of repeated lines, like "do not be far from me" in verses 11 and 21. And I notice how the imagery is really intense. David is not having a good day, and he's not happy about how God is handling that. And if that's all the time I've got, so be it. Right before I close my Bible and get back to my other work, I pause and I ask, is there any correspondence between what David's life in this psalm and my life is like right now? If the answer is no, then I can ask, well, do I know anyone else whose life looks like this? Probably. If I'm sufficiently engaged in the lives of people around me, which, by the way, is part of the good work God has for me no matter what pays the bills, there's someone in my network who's in rough shape. Now, once I have a person in mind, now I'm ready to ask how David's words to God back then can become my words or my friend's words to God now. Psalms don't tend to prioritize historical background, so I didn't worry too much about that. This psalm actually implies quite a lot about God and how he manages his mission in the world, so it'd be nice if I could make some time for that. And I did notice along the way that a lot of this psalm is quoted in the Gospels when describing Jesus' experience of dying on the cross, so there's an opportunity to ask canonical questions if I have time. And if I don't have time for those today, I can decide to come back to those tomorrow, or I can make a note to come back to those the next time I'm reading the Psalms. But at a minimum, I can ask a practical question or two that helps me align my strategies and tactics with the commander's intent as it gets explained here. Quick pause here to tell you about a couple of things we have going on besides this podcast. If you'd like to spend some time with other people who are excited about the theology of work and rest, who want to grow as stewards who act in keeping with their commander's intent, we've got a conference happening in Canton, Ohio. It's called the Good Work Conference. It's on September 28th, and there's a link to the conference website in the show notes of this episode. We also have something called Kibbe Consulting, where we do organizational leadership development. There's a link for that in the show notes as well. Now, one more example. 1 Corinthians 11, communion, right? A very strange set of problems surrounding communion that I'll bet your church has never had. People are lining up in order of income, richest to poorest, to take the bread and the cup. Some folks are getting drunk on the wine. That's weird. When you see things happening in a church context that you can't imagine happening in your church context, that's a good time to pull out the historical questions. There's probably some cultural context going on that will help us make sense of this. And in the case of the crazy Corinthians, it's going to go something like this. The Corinthian church was started by Paul some years earlier, but very quickly took on a kind of, we are Corinthian first and followers of Jesus second kind of identity, which meant the sorts of things they were doing fit right into their Corinthian context because they were just acting like normal pagan Corinthians. And when normal pagan Corinthians have a bunch of people over for a meal, they put the wealthy friends of the homeowner in one room and feed them first. Then they have the less economically advantaged guests in another room and feed them last. And if the servants who've been doing all the work thus far happen to get some by the end of the night, so be it. And if not, so be it. So we start with the question, why are the Corinthian Christians having such bizarre problems in the way they do communion? And then, using some historical background to guide us, we find out that the answer is those problems aren't bizarre at all if you just act like communion is a normal Corinthian meal. And from there, we can go to the practical question. In what ways has my practice or my church's practice of communion devolved so that it looks like the sort of thing that any normal heathen from Spokane would do? Communion is supposed to be weird. It's supposed to set the church apart from the culture around it. Is that happening? That's the practical question. And just to finish that thought, I get that communion is weird in that we drink a shot of grape juice and eat a tiny little cracker, and that's definitely weird from a secular point of view. But what is supposed to make communion weird is not that it involves walking to the front and picking up a cracker and some juice. What's supposed to make communion weird is that people who would not normally associate with each other, people who would not normally eat with each other, people who would normally have been clearly distinguished from each other in terms of social and economic positioning, those people are sitting together, eating together, being together in a way that the world around us can't make sense of. That's how we make communion weird again. So there you go. A few quick examples of how we can grow in our understanding of the commander's intent when we don't have an endless supply of time to do that. There is one other thing I think is worth doing in some contexts. If you're trying to get traction on short daily upgrades or refreshers of the commander's intent, what people call daily devotions or something like that, this last thing probably doesn't apply. Do what I just showed you with those three examples, and then follow me as I do some deeper dives into specific texts in the episodes ahead. But if you're trying to do something a little bit bigger than that, like you're part of a small group Bible study, or you're spending a longer period of time in a single book or section of the Bible during a sermon series, or especially if you're the one preparing to teach or preach, there's one other thing you'll want to do, and that is spend some time asking these 5 questions about your book or section of the Bible as a whole. So instead of going right to 1 Corinthians 11, spend a little time looking at 1 Corinthians, the whole book. This is where you learn about Corinth, about Paul's prior experience with that church, about Paul's writing style, where you do a skim of 1 Corinthians to see literary patterns, that sort of thing. And then you take that broad knowledge and have it on hand as you work through the individual parts. Now, even when you do that, even if you do the deep dive into the bigger picture, don't forget that the goal isn't to understand everything all at once. The goal is to grow. The goal is to get reps. The goal is to get better. Don't worry about answering every question. The priority right now is to identify the right questions in the first place. Let's get better at that, because if we ask the right questions, the answers will take care of themselves. Thanks for listening to the Extreme Stewardship Podcast. My name is Michael Kibbe, and I teach Bible and theology at Great Northern University in Spokane, Washington. My behind-the-scenes partner in this project is my brother, Ben Kibbe. Our editor-in-chief is Liam Olmsted. Art comes from Leah Leanhoutz, and of course, music is provided by Dave Murray of Daradoon Guitars. If this series has been helpful or challenging to you, or if you've got a story about extreme stewardship that you'd be willing to share, shoot us an email, extremestewards@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. You are, of course, welcome to like and subscribe and tell your friends and all that. What we really care about is that you have gotten better at making things good and good at making things better.